We have to stay involved. We have to stay in the game. Midterms are coming around the corner, and make no mistake, the Democrat Party wants to do whatever they possibly can to shut this movement down. Not just the Democrats, the rhinos. You see the manufactured attacks on JD, myself, my father, anyone who understands that this isn't the Republican Party anymore. It's the America First Party. It's the Make America Great Again Party. And we are...
What you just witnessed is the culmination of decades of erosion, the methodical demolition of Republican norms by a movement that has decided that democracy itself is negotiable, because here we are watching Donald Trump Jr. announcing to a cheering America Fest crowd that the Republican Party is dead, and declaring his father now leads the America First Party and the MAGA Party, and the crowd goes absolutely wild with jubilation, as if this were some kind of liberation rather than what it actually represents, which is the quiet burial of a party apparatus that once at least pretended to care about limited government, about institutional integrity, about something beyond the cult of personality. You heard him say the quiet part loud, that this isn't about policy disagreements anymore. This isn't about conservatism versus liberalism in any meaningful ideological sense. This is about fealty to a single family, a single brand, a single authoritarian impulse dressed up in the aesthetics of patriotism, while Trump Jr. claims the movement faces attacks from Democrats and rhinos as both parties head toward the 2026 midterm elections. And you have to pause at the construction of that sentence, because what he's doing is what authoritarians always do, which is positioning themselves as simultaneously the insurgent underdog, fighting the establishment, while also being the dominant force that will never relinquish power, the paradox at the heart of fascist rhetoric that allows them to be both victim and victor, depending on what the moment requires. But let me tell you what's coming next and why this matters, beyond just another Trump family member saying outrageous things to get applause, because the Make America Great Again movement is fracturing, as Republicans begin considering a future without Trump, with no clear path to holding his coalition together. And this fracturing is precisely why we're seeing this aggressive rebranding, this declaration that the Republican Party is over, because when you cannot maintain ideological coherence, when your movement is held together purely by the gravitational force of one man's personality and his willingness to transgress every norm, you have to keep escalating the rhetoric, you have to keep declaring new enemies, you have to keep insisting that everyone who doesn't bow is a traitor, because Trump's election exacerbated internal schisms within the GOP, moving it from a center coalition to a solidly right-wing party hostile to liberal views and any deviations from the party line, which is academic speak for what we all know, which is that this is no longer a political party, in any traditional sense, but rather an authoritarian cult of personality that happens to operate within the shell of what used to be the Republican Party. And here's the bombshell that should terrify everyone who cares about the survival of democratic institutions in this country, because Trump now dominates the Republican Party, which, purged of its anti-Trump forces, now acquiesces to his authoritarian behavior, meaning that the internal checks, the people within the party who might have once said, wait, this is too far, those people are gone. They've been systematically expelled through primary challenges, through social media harassment campaigns, through the machinery of what Trump-affiliated groups and activists are now using to pressure Senate Republicans to confirm controversial nominees in what represents a political weapon the president-elect did not possess during his first term. And this is the new infrastructure of authoritarian control, not tanks in the streets, but rather a parallel enforcement mechanism that operates through right-wing media, through social pressure, through the threat of being primaried by someone even more extreme if you dare to deviate from whatever Trump tweeted that morning. The sophistication here is chilling, because they've learned from the first term, they've learned that you don't need to abolish Congress, you just need to make sure that every single member of Congress knows that opposing Trump means the end of their political career, and they've built the machine to make that threat credible. Now watch what happens when you connect this to the broader pattern of what scholars are documenting, because a survey of more than 500 political scientists finds that the vast majority think the United States is moving swiftly from liberal democracy toward some form of authoritarianism, and these aren't partisan hacks. These are people who spend their entire professional lives studying how democracies die, and they're looking at the United States in 2024 and 2025 and saying, yes, this is it, this is what democratic backsliding looks like, because U.S. democracy will likely break down during the second Trump administration, in the sense that it will cease to meet standard criteria for liberal democracy, including full adult suffrage, free and fair elections, and broad protection of civil liberties, and I want you to sit with that for a second, because we're not talking about some hypothetical future threat. We're talking about political scientists looking at the evidence right now and concluding that American democracy as we understand it is in the process of fundamental transformation into something that doesn't meet the basic criteria for being called a democracy anymore. The ideological framework here draws directly from the illiberal playbook that we've seen deployed in Hungary under Viktor Orban, in Turkey under Erdogan, in Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro, and what's crucial to understand is that much of the Republican Party now embraces the idea that America's institutions have been corrupted by left-wing ideologies, and authoritarian movements commonly embrace the notion that their country's institutions have been subverted by enemies, which provides the justification for what comes next, which is the systematic purging and packing of those institutions, the weaponization of state power against political opponents, all under the banner of restoration, when what you're actually doing is demolition. This is the classic authoritarian move. You don't say, "I want to become a dictator." You say, "The institutions have been corrupted by our enemies, and we must purify them," and suddenly you've given yourself permission to do absolutely anything, because you've framed authoritarian power grabs as defensive measures, as necessary responses to existential threats. And the genius of Trump Jr.'s rhetoric in that clip is that he's preemptively declaring any criticism of this movement to be manufactured attacks, which is the ultimate epistemic closure, the complete rejection of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, people oppose you because your ideas are bad and your behavior is anti-democratic. No, it must be manufactured. It must be a conspiracy. Everyone who disagrees is part of the plot. And once you've established that framework, you've made it impossible to reason with your supporters, because any evidence against you becomes evidence of the conspiracy. Any criticism becomes proof that the deep state is attacking you. This is how authoritarian movements inoculate themselves against accountability. They build an intellectual architecture where disagreement is impossible, because disagreement itself is evidence of the enemy's perfidy. But here's what should absolutely horrify you about where we are right now, because 71% of Republicans now call themselves MAGA supporters, representing a 16-point increase in GOPers identifying with the MAGA movement between polls right before the 2024 election and March, which means this isn't a fringe movement anymore. This isn't just Trump's most extreme supporters. This is now the mainstream of the Republican Party. The center of gravity has shifted so dramatically that the authoritarian personality cult is now the norm rather than the exception. And when you have 71% of one of the two major political parties in America identifying with a movement that President Biden described as representing an extremism that threatens the very foundations of the republic, saying MAGA Republicans embrace anger, thrive on chaos, and live not in the light of truth but in the shadow of lies, then you're not talking about normal political disagreement anymore. You're talking about one party that has fundamentally abandoned its commitment to democratic norms and small d democratic values. The historical parallel that keeps echoing through my mind is the Weimar Republic. Not because I think we're about to see jackboots marching through American streets tomorrow morning, but because the pattern is so hauntingly similar. You have a democracy with strong institutions, with a written constitution, with traditions of civil society, and you watch as one party decides that democracy itself is the problem, that the institutions need to be captured or destroyed, that the very notion of loyal opposition is a luxury they can no longer afford. And what happens is this gradual then sudden transformation, where the regime contracts the space for dissent, for speech, for political opposition, such that while elections still happen, the opposition party can never win because the rules get rigged, so that the party in power never ever loses. And that's the plan. That's what Trump Jr. is celebrating when he says we are not going back. He's not talking about going back to Biden's policies. He's talking about never going back to a world where Democrats can win elections, never going back to a world where power can peacefully transfer based on the will of voters. Now let me connect this to what's happening right at this very moment in state legislatures across the country. Republican Party chairs have been turning their positions into bully pulpits to attack and purge more moderate Republicans, leaving behind deeply divided organizations with decimated staffs increasingly dependent on ultra-conservative mega-donors. And this is the infrastructure of authoritarian consolidation at the state level. The same pattern playing out in Colorado, in Texas, in Michigan, where MAGA loyalists are systematically taking over the party apparatus and then using that control to enforce absolute loyalty to Trump. The Colorado GOP story is particularly instructive because a list of alleged traitors who opposed the MAGA-lined chair included almost 200 names featuring a U.S. representative, former Secretary of State, previous state Republican Party chair, about half the Republicans in the state House, 2/3 of Republican state senators, and 25 GOP county party chairs, which means that anyone who dared to suggest that maybe the party should focus on winning elections rather than enforcing ideological purity is now marked as an enemy, is now on a literal enemies list. And if you think that's hyperbole, consider that this is exactly how authoritarian movements consolidate power, through lists, through purges, through making it clear that dissent will be punished. The intellectual architecture underlying this transformation draws heavily from what critical race theorists would call white supremacy, what feminist theorists would recognize as patriarchal backlash, what queer theorists understand as heteronormative panic, because when Trump Jr. said young white men were left behind by DEI for a generation, what he's doing is activating the precise resentments that authoritarians always activate, the sense among privileged groups that equality feels like oppression, that when you're accustomed to preferential treatment, equality feels like discrimination. This is the ideological substrate of American fascism, this aggrieved entitlement dressed up as patriotism, this sense that the natural order of things involves white men having unquestioned authority, and anything that challenges that is tyranny, and the grotesque irony is that they frame their movement as anti-elite while being bankrolled by billionaires, as anti-establishment while controlling every lever of government power they can reach, as pro-freedom while systematically dismantling civil liberties for anyone who doesn't look like them or think like them or pray like them. But wait, because here's where it gets even more disturbing when you look at what's actually happening within the MAGA coalition itself. Because MAGA is now mired in conflict over Israel, white nationalism, purity tests, and disputes among its biggest personalities, making it less relevant in shaping the president's agenda and less capable of uniting. On this internal fracturing is precisely why you're seeing this aggressive rhetoric about party loyalty, this insistence that everyone fall in line, because authoritarian movements always face this problem where they're held together by personal loyalty rather than ideology, and when the strong man shows any weakness, the whole thing threatens to collapse into factional warfare. The fact that the 4-day America Fest gathering revealed more peril than promise for potential successors to Trump, with tensions foreshadowing treacherous waters to navigate in coming years, tells you that they know the clock is ticking, they know that Trump's hold is personal rather than institutional, and they're desperately trying to transform MAGA from a personality cult into a durable authoritarian movement that can survive beyond one man. And this brings us to the horrifying question of what comes next, because Trump has made clear he intends to govern with loyalists, and now dominates the Republican Party, which, purged of its anti-Trump forces, acquiesces to his authoritarian behavior, which means there are no more internal checks, no more adults in the room, no more generals or establishment figures who might slow-walk his most extreme impulses. The machinery of American authoritarianism is being assembled right now in plain sight, and what's particularly insidious is that they're doing it through ostensibly legal mechanisms, through executive orders, through agency restructuring, through judicial appointments, through all the tools that exist within the system but deployed with anti-democratic intent. This is what scholars call democratic backsliding, as opposed to democratic breakdown. It's the slow squeeze rather than the sudden coup, and it's actually much harder to resist because at every individual step, you can say, well, technically this is legal, even as the aggregate effect is the transformation of democracy into competitive authoritarianism. The implications for organized resistance are profound, because publicly opposing the government now comes with a cost, as Trump has issued executive orders barring lawyers with firms he doesn't like from entering government buildings, and fear of government retribution is spreading through society, and this is the mechanism through which authoritarian consolidation happens, not through dramatic confrontations but through the gradual normalization of retaliation, through the creeping sense that speaking out might cost you your job, your grants, your livelihood, and once that fear takes hold, once people start self-censoring because they're worried about consequences, you don't need to arrest everyone, you don't need show trials, you just need to make a few examples and let everyone else draw the logical conclusion about what happens to people who resist. What we're witnessing in real time is the culmination of a process that political scientists have been warning about for years, the transformation of the Republican Party from a conservative political party in the traditional sense into what one scholar calls having completely taken control of the party with Trump at the helm, and the 2024 GOP platform reflecting that complete capture, where the platform is described as a series of outtakes from Trump's rally speeches rather than any coherent ideological vision. This is the difference between authoritarianism and normal politics. In normal politics, parties have ideas about how society should be organized, and they compete to convince voters that their ideas are better. In authoritarianism, the party exists purely as a vehicle for the leader's will, and the measure of loyalty is not ideological agreement, but personal submission. The theoretical framework here connects to what Hannah Arendt wrote about totalitarianism, the way it destroys the very possibility of political plurality, the way it demands that everyone think the same thoughts and speak the same words, and acknowledge the same reality that the leader proclaims regardless of what the evidence shows. When Trump Jr. says that attacks on his father are manufactured, he's not making an empirical claim that can be tested against evidence. He's making a theological claim that reality itself must conform to the needs of the movement, and anyone who perceives reality differently must be a heretic, must be an enemy. This is the epistemic closure that makes authoritarian movements so dangerous and so difficult to dislodge. Once you've trained your followers to reject any information that doesn't confirm their prior beliefs, you've made them functionally immune to argument, to evidence, to persuasion, and at that point the only language that matters is power. And so when we watch this clip of Trump Jr. declaring the Republican Party dead and the MAGA Party ascendant, what we're really watching is a key moment in the American authoritarian project, the moment when they stop pretending that this is about conservatism or limited government, or any of the old ideological markers, and they just openly declare that this is about loyalty to the Trump family, about the permanent political dominance of a movement defined entirely by its commitment to a single leader. Trump Jr. told the crowd that anyone who understands that this isn't the Republican Party anymore recognizes it's the America First Party, the Make America Great Again Party, and they are not going back, and that phrase "not going back" should send chills down your spine, because what he means is that they have no intention of ever allowing Democrats to regain power, that the goal is permanent minoritarian rule by a faction that has given up on persuading majorities and instead committed itself to manipulating, undermining, and if necessary overriding the democratic process. The path forward for those of us committed to democratic values requires understanding that this is not normal politics. This is not a situation where we can compromise our way to better outcomes or wait for the pendulum to swing back naturally. What we're facing is an authoritarian movement that has captured one of America's two major political parties, that controls the most powerful military and surveillance apparatus in human history, that has demonstrated its willingness to overturn elections and deploy violence against opponents, and that is systematically dismantling the guardrails that might constrain its power. The work of resistance must therefore operate on multiple levels simultaneously: legal challenges to unconstitutional actions, grassroots organizing to maintain and expand democratic participation, coalition building across traditional ideological lines to unite everyone committed to small d democracy regardless of their other disagreements, international solidarity with pro-democracy movements facing similar threats globally, and perhaps most importantly, the constant public articulation of why democracy matters, why authoritarianism is unacceptable, why we cannot normalize what is happening, even as the sheer volume of outrages threatens to overwhelm our capacity for outrage. This is the fight of our generation. The question of whether American democracy survives the Trump era, or whether we're living through the transition point that future historians will mark as the beginning of American authoritarianism. And Trump Jr.'s declaration that the Republican Party is dead, that MAGA has taken over, that they are never going back. That's not bluster. That's not just red meat for the base. That's a statement of intent from a movement that has looked at democratic norms and concluded they're obstacles to be eliminated, rather than constraints to be respected. The terrifying thing is that they might succeed unless we build a resistance movement that matches their commitment with our own, that refuses to normalize authoritarianism, that continues to fight for democracy even when the odds seem impossible. Because the alternative, the world where MAGA permanently captures American politics and transforms this country into a competitive authoritarian regime, where elections are held but outcomes are predetermined, where dissent is legal but comes with unbearable costs, where the forms of democracy persist but the substance has been hollowed out, that world is one we cannot accept, cannot accommodate, cannot allow to become our reality. And so we fight, we organize, we resist, we speak truth to power, we build coalitions, we protect the vulnerable, we defend institutions, we hold the line, because the future is unwritten, and authoritarianism only wins if we let it, if we give up, if we accept the unacceptable. And I for one refuse to accept it, refuse to normalize it, refuse to stop fighting for the possibility of a genuinely democratic future, where power flows from the people, rather than being hoarded by demagogues and their enablers. That's what's at stake when Trump Jr. declares the GOP dead and MAGA victorious. That's what we're fighting for. That's why we cannot afford to look away, or tune out, or pretend this is just another election cycle. This is the moment, right now, and what we do with it will determine whether democracy survives, or whether we become the generation that let it die through 1,000 small surrenders, disguised as pragmatism, or exhaustion, or the simple inability to believe that it could really happen here. It is happening here, it's happening right now, and the only question is what we're going to do about it.